All right. Welcome and thank you for joining us for the first webinar in this year's Virtual Visiting Scholar webinar series. I'm Virginia Rhodes, the project director of the ARC Network, and we're very excited to host our latest cohort of the Virtual Visiting Scholars Program. This program empowers scholars to complete metasyntheses and meta-analyses of existing literature to address critical issues relevant to equity and STEM. Now, before we introduce today's speakers, I would like to take care of a few housekeeping items. First, I want to let you know this webinar is being recorded, and we will share the recording with registrants and post it to our ARC Network website. Live captioning is also available through Zoom. If you hover your mouse over the bottom of the Zoom window, you'll see a number of different menu options. And to the right is the icon for captioning. Selecting the caret will allow you to customize your captioning. In the center are options for Q&A and chat. And for the beginning of our webinar, you'll only be able to view chat messages from the ARC team. We'll also use the chat to share links to resources and our feedback survey at the end of this webinar. We will open the chat for participants once we finish with the prompted part of our discussion. And if you have any questions for the speakers, please add them to the Q&A, where you can also upvote certain questions. Next, we have ARC Network's PI, Dr. Heather Metcalf, who will share more about who we are as the ARC Network.
Thank you, Virginia. As Virginia mentioned, I'm the PI of the ARC Network and Director of Research for our home organization, the Women in Engineering Proactive Network, or WEPAN. The goal of the ARC Network is to create and cultivate a broad community that bridges the gap between researchers and practitioners. As the STEM Equity Brain Trust, the ARC Network works to promote systemic change by collecting previous work and producing new perspectives, methods, and interventions through convenings, a curated resource library, emerging research workshops, a virtual visiting scholar program, and online events like this one. The ARC Network is built on and works through a framework integrating inclusion, intersectionality, and intentionality. We strive to ensure that our work accounts for the social stratifications that intertwine to determine the unique inequities that folks experience. The ARC Network is funded through a cooperative agreement with the NSF Advanced Program with our home organization, WEPAN. To learn more about the ARC Network, we encourage you to visit equityandstem.org, where you can also join the community if you haven't already. You can also find us on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter at ARC Equity in STEM and hashtag Equity in STEM. Now, ARC Network's co-PI and Community Engagement Director, Dr. Stephanie Page, will briefly introduce our speakers and moderate today's discussion.
Hello, everyone. Once again, for another year, we are so incredibly excited for today's discussion featuring our latest Virtual Visiting Scholars cohort. Today, we are joined by Drs. Brooke Coley and Jess Gold. Dr. Brooke Coley is founding executive director of the Center for Research Advancing Racial Equity, Justice, and Sociotechnical Innovation Centered in Engineering, or RARE Justice, an unprecedented testbed for innovating and modeling anti-racist and equitable engineering futures. Brooke is also an assistant professor of engineering, both at Arizona State University. Dr. Coley's research lies in the intersection of racial equity, mental health, and qualitative research methods encompassing critical theory, participatory action research, and arts-based research methods. Her work is anchored in an intentional amplification of the voices of minoritized populations in STEM, with a goal of informing disruption of the pervasive systemic equities found in racialized organizations, such as institutions of higher education. Dr. Coley earned her Doctor of Philosophy degree in bioengineering with a concentration in biomechanics from the University of Pittsburgh. She also completed her Bachelor of Science in Chemical Engineering at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County as a Meyerhoff Scholar. Dr. Jessica Gold is a postdoctoral researcher at Northeastern University in the Sociology and Anthropology Department. She earned her BA in Sociology from the College of William and Mary and her PhD in Sociology at the University of California, Davis. Jess's research focuses on organizational analyses of gender and racial inequality, including university faculty hiring and scientific teams. She is a mixed methods researcher using computational text and network analysis, quantitative statistical methods, and qualitative interviews. Thank you both for joining us today, Doctors Brooke Coley and Jess Gold. And I'm going to stop share so we can get you pinned for our conversation today. So to start, we're really, truly excited to host this conversation because it allows us to learn a little bit more about who you are. And so for our first question, could you share a bit more about the project you're working on as a virtual visiting scholar, and share also a little bit about how your background shapes that? And could we start with you, Dr. Coley?
Good afternoon. It's an honor to be here. Thank you again for selecting or seeing something in this perspective that I put forward. I'm really excited about the work. This project is entitled Racing Against the Clock, a meta-analysis of publication timelines across STEM equity research and STEM education outlets. And this work is to conduct a qualitative meta-analysis that's going to look at how the topical area of research, specifically thinking about STEM equity and faculty that do STEM equity work, how the topic of their choosing is playing into the publication timeline. And so I think, ever since the pandemic, there's been backlog. And I know we'll probably get into that a little bit later, but this work is driven because I'll go to the background. As an engineering faculty that advances disruptive work to, in fact, try to move towards real transformation and equitable futures, it seems as though there may be penalty in that process. The journals are staffed with volunteers that span different areas of expertise. And, to some extent, this whole process has been slowed down. But certain areas of expertise aren't equitably represented on the journals. And I think this work will help us think a little more intentionally about how some people may be excluded or disproportionately disadvantaged by having to wait for this peer review process to move. And ordinarily, maybe the prescription would be patience. However, when faculty are set to the rhythm of the tenure track, and one of the critical metrics is the generation of peer-reviewed manuscripts, you are ultimately on a clock and you are racing against that clock. And so I think this work will help us bring to light and amplify something that could be a disparity that is targeting or inadvertently targeting certain scholars and preventing them from advancing in the field. And I think the way that we can see this is typically this work is being put forth by faculty that already have minoritized identities. And so if we think about one of the critical metrics being delayed, we can see how there can be a connection to faculty not advancing in that tenure and promotion process. And so I think something that is just aggregating several individual studies, we could take a step back and see something that might be in plain sight before our eyes. And so I'm hoping that this work will sort of unpack that.
Thank you. And Dr. Gold, how about you? What are you working on, and how has your background shaped that?
Sorry, I was on mute. All right. Yeah, just again, thank you so much for having me here and having me as a virtual visiting scholar this year. I'm really excited to work on this project and to work with the people at ARC. It's such a wonderful team, and I've really loved seeing you guys at conferences and other workshops over the last couple of years. It's been a great community to be a part of. So the title of the project that I proposed for the Virtual Visiting Scholar Year is called Bringing the People Back In, a meta-analysis of equity workers in academic institutions. And it follows a lot of the same sort of reasons why I think is Brooke's project, which is really cool that they go so well together, which is looking at this often like invisible labor of people who are doing equity work in academia, and how can, what ways can we illuminate and support that work? And so the project that I'm looking at is very just broadly who are these people doing this kind of work, and what contexts and what institutions, and what are sort of patterns that we can learn from that, because there's a pretty vast, at least academic literature on why we need equity in faculty and in STEM fields, and a pretty decent amount of work on how that's being done, on projects that are done, on ways to achieve equity goals. But there's very little work identifying, again, those individuals behind the work, behind the project. And so again, this is often a very devalued form of work in academia. It's not something that counts towards tenure track. It's often, even if it's counted as service, it's not the same as publishing or other forms of sort of valuation. But it's just as valuable for the people who do the work and also who they're doing it for. And so so it's sort of just a broad, again, meta-analysis sort of literature review, but bringing in computational methods to use to look at as large of a corpus as I can. I mean, I've already started the searches, and I'm up to several thousand documents. And so it'll be getting plain text from those and using pretty basic computational tools, like using named entity recognizers to just identify when people are mentioned in these projects. And then keyword and context searches to get more into sort of how those people are talked about. So I can get demographic information on institutions, very broadly. So, like R1s, community colleges, HBCUs, and sort of our people, faculty, staff, administrators are sort of trying to do some broad categorization of who's doing this work. And and it fits in, I think, with previous work I've done on looking at different types of undervalued work in academic STEM. Specifically, I've looked at engaged scholarship and identifying people who do engaged work and how that plays out in faculty hiring positions. So again, looking at kind of types of work that people do in academia that's especially tied to women and people of color, and how the work that they're doing becomes undervalued in the actual career of academia, of an academic career. And then on my postdoctoral project that I've been on the last 2 years, we've been studying the advanced program using mostly social network analysis. So again, looking less at the programs of advance and more the people in the advanced program. So again, I'm just really interested in people and who's doing this work, and how best to make that invisible labor more part of the conversation of value in academia. So yeah.
Thank you. And, one thing that I'm excited about is sort of the revelation part, or the uncovering part of both of your projects. So there's invisible labor, and then also I think invisible obstacles that your work is addressing. But I want to hear from you about what aspects are of your projects you are most excited about exploring, and then if you could touch a little bit about what you're hoping your project will illuminate about how we research and practice STEM equity. And Jess, would you like to start us on that one? You're muted.
I'm on mute again. Sorry, I just keep going. I'm excited. To just sort of start uncovering and unpacking sort of who, again, like I was saying, identifying who these people are, because I feel like these are questions that I've had for other projects I've been on that haven't, that information hasn't been available in sort of like a meta-analysis or sort of like a here's what we know kind of way. And so I think this will really just personally illuminate pathways into other research questions that I have. And also sort of just personally, I'm really excited for the computational work. It seems like the last year I've been doing just like mostly writing, and I'm actually really excited to get back into some of the data work. And yeah, computational text analysis always has just so many challenges that come up along the way that really inform what you're asking and how you're asking it. And so I'm totally anticipating those, but also just excited to to start working with the data.
And how about you, Brooke?
So this was a good question, because I think I'm excited about a lot of things. I'm excited about the opportunity to hold standpoint epistemology. And, I know that epistemic exclusion is a real thing. And so, as Jess mentioned, there's been a devaluing of knowledge that hasn't aligned with this Eurocentric positioning of what knowledge counts. And so what I'm really excited about in this work is, so I broke my study up into 4 major components: collect, code, analyze, and then report. And so I simplify that because I think I want this to be a very a simple approach to uncover the profound. And so I wanted to keep it very just straightforward, to show how there is so much information often right in front of us, but we're using other things as metrics. We're using other things to get ascertained value or merit or, true scholarship. And so I'm excited about the opportunity to empirically demonstrate something that I've had a hunch about for a while now. One thing I didn't mention in the first question was how this even came personal to me. Was as a faculty currently and still on the tenure track. I am an assistant professor, so I'm still pre-tenured. I have a National Science Foundation grant, and we call it the Learning from the Pros study. And that work started around 2018, and we were following Black graduate students in engineering around the country. And in that work, we had already established a rapport with the graduate students prior to the onset of COVID. And then when COVID onset, I at the time had 2 Black graduate students, and then eventually 4 myself in my own lab. And our own experiences let me know that I needed to check in on that community. And so that work, that was the original intent, was to think about how these students are navigating in the landscape of academia and how identity-related organizations support them, NSBE and Black Greek letter organizations specifically. That's where we started. But the work uncovered so much more because of overlapping the period of COVID. So we had COVID, systemic racial unrest, and then on top of the rapport that we'd already had with them. So naturally, we moved into a participatory, community-based project. And so why I say that, you're like, get to the point. The point is, we had direct communication with an audience that was suffering in real time in academia, and people were more concerned about the process of the manuscript, the tradition, the wording, the semantics, than pushing the work forward so that people could know how to meet the needs of these students in real time. And we lost people. There are people that will now not cross that bridge and enter academia or, obtain their PhD. And the faculty on the other side, I saw the other side of it, that Black faculty are often not there, visible, to meet these students and support them through this. And one of the main reasons is, publications, grant funds, and these things that are sort of outside of your control, whether or how fast they happen, advance, the funds are secured. And so in this project, what I think is helpful is to kind of think about, is it more important for us to get knowledge out? What is the real purpose of publications? Is it to share what needs to be done? Is it to communicate? Is it to, stimulate a call to action? Is it to have implications for institutions of accountability? And I think there's been a lot of comfort. And for me, I think disruption is not comfortable. And so I'm excited about being able to show in the literature how we have things that are in comfort are more likely to progress. Things that are disruptive are met with delay. And we have to, address it. And so in my coding phase of the project, I am going to establish a continuum from all of the articles that are representing STEM, any article manuscript that has a STEM equity component will be categorized. And the continuum that I'm envisioning is equality, equity, or critical and disruptive. And so if you think about placing publications along that continuum, what I'm excited about is that what might come out based on some preliminary, I guess, pilot studies that I've done in this space, I anticipate that as we move to that riskier end of the continuum, right, then that publication timeline increases. And so ultimately what that could mean is that we really are in this ecosystem rewarding safety and comfort and penalizing disruption. And the disruption is what's needed to actually make change. And so I'm excited about having something in black and white, since that is the, I guess, Eurocentric notion of scholarship. It doesn't matter if it's not published. I'm hoping that through this work, we can amplify or make visible what has not been named. So that's what's really exciting me. And yeah, so I'll stop there.
Well, something that comes to mind, and I think I mentioned as we were preparing for today that I might ask an off-the-cuff question. So there are so many thematic connections between both of your projects. And in particular, the connectivity between the fact that the people who are more likely to do this work and be invested to the point of wanting to produce so that others can build on, adapt, apply. And then there are barriers, of course, if the people who do that work in the different places where they're positioned are either undervalued, under-resourced, under-recognized. I think that's also something that we're dealing with is, especially when equity work became quote unquote popular, you also saw a disruption in, I think, some of the patterns of equitable recognition, right? So I'm thinking I'd like to have you each respond to sort of what's exciting you about each other's project. And, where do you see that work going? Where do you see the novel? You're both doing novel applications in different ways. So if Brooke, if you could start us just with a couple of comments about what you're excited about from Jess's side, and Jess, we'll go to you.
So I had an opportunity to read Jess's perspectives, and it resonated with me that there's intentionality to look at the institutions like that. So I think, and Jess, correct me if I'm wrong in any way, but I see her work as being very intentional to paying attention to context. And I think that I appreciate that detail because I think it is what makes how we interpret the things that we're observing different. Without the context, you can miss what is inequitable about the situation. And so I think there has to be intentionality to not just these issues, but these issues in context at all times. And typically these things get treated disparately, right? So if we think about, I always have to bring him up, Victor Ray and his theory of racialized organizations, that racialized decoupling, the policy is the policy, but the policy is not taking into account race, or the policy is not taking into account gender. Kimberly Crenshaw with the intersectionality. If we're not thinking about the full context, then we're not really treating the problem. And so I saw that she had notion for the workers, who they were, the institutions, the regions, and similar, I didn't mention, but in my study, some of the information that is going to be captured from each of the manuscripts is the author, right? Because typically, a lot of times you see the same names advancing related work. And sometimes there's reputation, and then there's, the generation of new knowledge, and sometimes those are coincident and sometimes they're not, right? But so paying attention to who the work is coming from, the institution type. So is it a traditionally white institution, Hispanic serving institution, or HBCU, and the region. So where it is, which right now we know that if you're in Florida, your experience may be very different as a faculty than if you're in Virginia or California or, Oklahoma. So all of those things take, the context matters. And I appreciate that Jess has been very intentional to have that as a part of her project.
Thank you. And what about you, Jess?
Yeah, thanks, Brooke. That was really good to hear. I'm glad that resonated with you. Yeah, I think I really am excited to see what your project comes out with, because I feel like it has such a specific focus on a very specific problem, which I feel like makes it a really good place to actually start making changes, to see what we can do differently for that. And I think just the applicability of it is really exciting in this space. And I think, and it relates to also what you're studying, which is, as you mentioned, epistemic exclusion, and how people who study, or whose knowledge produced follows certain epistemologies that isn't valued and has a harder time making it through publication venues, and therefore has implications for tenure track, and is therefore, devalued in departments, that I think really specifically focusing on this time to publication gives a very empirical measure of that problem, which I think is really exciting to see, because I think in just a measurement way, that's something that isn't out there, and is hard to have, empirical measures of devaluation and empirical measures of inequality. And so that is super exciting to see, because I think that's a really important form of knowledge to produce that can be immediately applied. And I'm also just really excited to see, again, from a measurement perspective, how you're measuring that continuum you were just talking about of equity, equality, and disruption. And I think, it'll be I'm sure you have, a way that you're already thinking about coding that, but I'm sure that'll change through the coding. And I'm just really excited to see what you come up with, and how, again, how that can be used in other aspects of doing this work. And so I just think that there's so much that can come out of this project, that I'm really excited to see.
No, I appreciate that, Jess, because when I read yours, I thought that there was a lot of synergy. Because I actually, my first inclination was, I wonder. So some time ago, I did an op-ed that was as a faculty member, and it was about being hyper visible and invisible at the same time. And so I thought, I wonder, when you do your magazine searches, if that would have been a piece that comes up in your searches. but it made me think, I am one of your people. I am one of the people in your study. And then what I'm measuring is impacted by the work that you're, doing. So they're super, a lot of overlap there for sure. And I'm excited about that. And another thing that I think is interesting about what both of our studies stand to do, they both will uncover information relative to like the evidence that comes out of that study, but they both will inform, they will be able to create an awareness that can't be denied. And I think that part is that's like the double, it's like the double power, because I think there's a lot of, I think there are a lot of instances where things continue because we say we don't know better. We don't know, or maybe we meaning like the institution goes under the guise of ignorance. And so I think these types of studies are so important because then we can bring to light and make something explicit and clear. And then that can lead to accountability. So like once they know what the story of these equity workers are, once we see what the true empirical evidence shows about, are these publication timelines distorted with topic, then we can turn and say, so now what? And that's the part that gets me really excited about the combination of our efforts.
I think there are a lot of folks shaking heads right now. And I want to remind our audience that you can drop your questions in the Q&A, and we'll go ahead and start to open up the chat as our guests are responding to the last question that we've prepared them for. To get serious, if we haven't been already, we have a lot of really stressful and strenuous, not new, but still, I'd say elevated context under which we're doing this work. And, I think it's important for our audience to kind of hear how COVID-19, you shared a little bit about that, and then how current legal and legislative efforts, particularly around anti-DEI, anti-racism, anti-trans, anti-disability, how the amplification of these efforts, especially I think in our national awareness, has impacted your research interests. And Jess, would you like to start us there?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think this is such a big question. Again, there's decades of research and efforts towards equity in STEM, and it's not that much has changed in recent years. It's the same problems, but there is certainly a different awareness especially in the beyond academia world and in the public perceptions of universities and colleges, and just like what equity means, and whether it's good or bad, and that's really come out in like legislative efforts. And yeah, I mean, honestly, I feel like Brooke already kind of brought this up for my project, but that's why I also really included that piece about context and institutional type and location, because that matters so much for the people who are doing this work. And so the sort of timeline that I'm looking at is really like around the year 2000 to 2023. And something I'll definitely be paying attention to is changes, especially in the last, say, like 3 years, and how these people are how workers are talked about. And in other work that I've done, there's definitely, in talking to people who are doing equity work, a heightened sense of risk, which as a researcher researching such people doing this kind of work, it becomes really important to also consider how I'm talking about that, and also where like my findings are published, because it can be risky for the people that we're writing about to be exposed, and so we're talking about this idea that like it's invisible labor, and it's important to make that visible in order to support people doing this work in institutions. And at the same time, there's this really heightened sense, I feel like recently, of protecting, it's supporting protecting in terms of, anonymity, and also making sure people aren't targets to people who are downloading names from websites, or specifically looking for certain kinds of faculty. Because so I feel like there is this tension that's really always been there, but has certainly been more heightened based on the current legal and political landscape. And so I wouldn't say that's something that I have a solution for, because I still think it is important that we continue doing this work, and offering support and making the invisible labor more visible, and moving it towards more valuation in academia, and trying to remember that, like, the risk that we're introducing in doing this work too.
And Brooke, do you have anything to add on that, on those thoughts?
Yeah, I think I already mentioned sort of my positioning with COVID in this, but I'll go a little bit to what Jess spoke about, because it's in terms of the risk, because I think that's the part that resonates most with me as a tenure track faculty. You get all types of, some people call it guidance, some people call it warning, but you're told pre-tenure, don't move, don't pursue this stuff now. Wait till you're, I think the quote is, protected and promoted, and then, you can pursue this. And the reality is, for me, that if you wait, you might die waiting, right? So it's like the current moment is a place where you are, I feel I'm a target either way. I'm a target if I pursue the work, because yes, people are looking up faculty associated with, if you Google Brooke Coley and anti-racism or anti-Blackness, people are spending their time finding people to harass in that way around these, anti-DEI agendas. That is real. And if I sort of allow that to make me cower or retreat and not advance this work, then I'm a target in the systems that continue to perpetuate these inequities, right? So if I'm going to be a target either way, I'm going to be a target on the side of disruption, right? And I think that one of the things that I really grapple with, and it's why I choose to do disruptive work, is because I feel that once you have the answers and then you see the responses, then you know what it is. There's no more illusion, right? And so one of the questions that's really at the core of me is, do we really want equity? Do we really want it? Because I find it hard to believe that, it's 2023, 2020, we had sort of this momentum coupled with the pandemic. Many of us were having a racism pandemic or other pandemics that were happening. And, the world only universally acknowledged one. While for me, I was, living two very real pandemics at the same time. And I think there's something about the performative nature of all the momentum that came to support, be in solidarity, all the different ways it was expressed. But I feel that there's not a real understanding of the penalty that is at stake for faculty advancing equity work. And I say that because if these journals have, I'm an athlete, so I think of things in terms of sports and teams. It makes it real easy, right? Everybody can understand a team. If you're putting together a team, if you're putting together a basketball team, you need guards, you need somebody that's going to shoot, you need somebody that's going to pass, you need a rebounder. I don't understand why journals committed to equity in 2023 wouldn't have reviewers that have anti-racism expertise. it's not being prepared for the body of knowledge that is being developed in real time. And so I'm hopeful that this work can help through the creation of these equity portfolio dashboards. That's just a way of using data visualization to amplify and showcase the results of this work. I hope the journals will look at that and learn and be more intentional to build teams that are comprehensive to meet the demands of the work that's coming forth today. I think it's insufficient to tell people, I can't find reviewers for your paper. And yeah, okay, you've had my paper 8 months. So if I don't, come and follow up, for every paper, that becomes taxing. The individual PI shouldn't have that onus on them, particularly with the weight that metric has in their advancement. And so I think this just shows how this system is really convoluted, and all these things, connect and influence each other. And so what seems like a study just about publication timelines could have a really vast impact on understanding some of the underpinning inequities that keep perpetuating through to the surface. And another thing that could come out of it is whatever the empirical evidence says, maybe that is in a publication that then people that are writing letters for tenure, writing letters for people going up for tenure, let's say they don't have the 20 manuscripts that they need for tenure. Maybe they have 14, maybe 5 are still in review and have been for 2 years. Maybe this work will enable a tenure letter writer to speak to that. The journals are understaffed, particularly in these areas of expertise, which has this impact. And it's not the scholar not producing. The scholar isn't producing in a system that can't accommodate its need in real time. And so I think reframing, even giving us an opportunity to reframe the narrative or change the narrative to be more reflective of the inequities, as opposed to making the narrative be descriptive of shortcomings. It's not shortcomings, it's how, the systems that we're operating in are making things real. So yeah, I think that we're at a critical crossroads with all the different directions, polarized support for DEI. And I think both of these works are well timed to have a real contribution, maybe even, I think, bigger than maybe I originally thought. The more I think about it, the implications seem even greater.
And I was thinking as you were both talking, and I want to remind folks, we do have a little bit of time if there are questions from the audience, but I was thinking a lot about the connectivity in your work too, around the context of how folks doing this work, we are more likely to both identify and express our positionality. So, whether that is through the work that we do, expressing what maybe people don't know that they see. So, I'm going to experience things a certain way because people are going to label me a Black woman like that. But there are also the pieces that someone may share that you might not notice. So if someone doesn't have an obvious physical manifesting disability, and they share their invisible disabilities, they share context of their gender and sexuality that people might not automatically glean or assign or define for them externally. Within this work, we tend to expose a lot about ourselves, and that can also inform, particularly when you're talking about journals, right? And the fact that these communities are relatively small, especially once you get into a specific discipline. And especially if you are, for example, a basic scientist or an engineer who is moving into social sciences, humanities, equity work, justice work. And then, there's also the reality of, as you both have mentioned, how much is exposed about us who are doing this work. And whether that is valued or undervalued, there is still something to kind of like the presence, because I think we also serve in a lot of spaces, which I'm curious if that comes out in either of your researches. You know, we serve to boost the institutions that want to self-promote or label themselves as virtuous and benefactors of underrepresented or underserved groups and populations. So I think a lot about the various contexts, and I think there will be a lot that will be revealed about the implications of your work, I think, as things move forward. We're close to closing time, and so I just want to see if there were questions that you had for each other or just additional things that have come to mind throughout our conversation today. How about you, Brooke? Anything top of mind for you?
I actually think we could have some conversations. I know you had 3 realms that you will be looking for your the context for your investigation, but the realm that is from the peer-reviewed spectrum, we could talk there because, you know, we may have some there could be overlap in some of those papers, and it'd be interesting to even just, you said, which was true, as I go through the coding, I'm probably going to, you know, go back and forth and iterate. And I think for sure, like what makes that final line between equality and equity, or equity and critical and disruptive. But that may even be something that would be stimulating and you know, catalyzing to discuss with you. Is like thinking about some of those papers and, you know, just where would this be on your continuum? How would you see this? Or, you know, thinking about the equity workers, would you put these efforts or the things you're getting from their stories? Maybe for me, it's thinking about the manuscript in terms of, is it, would it be classified as equality, equity, or critical disruptive? And maybe in your realm, it could be, you know, how are the tasks or the ways that these workers are experiencing these things? Is it that they experience the greatest turmoil when they're actually doing something that is in that disruptive realm? So there are lots of questions. I always have questions, Jess, anytime.
Yeah, no, I totally agree that there's so much overlap. And I think especially as we get towards, you know, more towards like working with the data and like developing various measures and coding, I think there could be some really interesting questions across the two in terms of, you know, like I'm looking at sort of who's doing and where certain types of work, and would you classify that based on the measure you come up with as like where on the spectrum of disruptiveness, and where are those projects coming from? Are they, you know, coming from certain parts of the country or parts of the world, or types of institutions? And I think that together that could actually lend to some really interesting questions as well, that sort of just put the measures together basically.
When you said that, yes. And two, you know, like maybe which institutions are really leading in transformation. We might uncover that if you start seeing like a lot of the disruptive and critical clustering in these same regions and institutions. Yeah, that could be totally insightful. Thanks for saying that.
Well, thank you both so much. As a biochemist and biophysicist, you have me at catalysis and synergy. And I think, you know, really as someone who was raised to have a social justice orientation to the world, there's a lot about the work that the both of you are doing that just speaks to me. And I'm really appreciative, because I think even in approaching these questions, even in the context of being a part of communities that are working to drive disruption and equity and justice, it's disruptive to ask these questions, even within the context of our larger community. And it's disruptive to, you know, to review what's already out there and to essentially take critical approaches and to question some of the assumptions. And, so this is critical in so many different ways. And it's part of why I love the Virtual Visiting Scholars Program. And it's part of why I'm always excited to explore and have discussion with our new cohorts, because I'm sure there were so many people jotting down notes as you were talking, and it gives us a lot to think about. So I just have to take a moment and say, we're grateful for you, and to just say thank you for what you're doing and thank you for existing. We always have to make time for that, especially these days, but we also got to learn to do it when things aren't amplified and exacerbated. But I'm going to shift to sharing screen as we close out today. And again, thank you to both of our amazing speakers. Our Virtual Visiting Scholars Program is near and dear to all of our hearts, and it's always a pleasure to welcome new cohort members and to our community who joined us today. Thank you for bringing your full selves to this work, and we thank you for spending time with us. Before we head out, I just have a couple of announcements. As always, it's incredibly helpful when you provide feedback, and we ask that you complete the brief survey on your experience with today's webinar, and that link is being dropped in the chat. Also, as many of you have come to know, when we are welcoming a new Virtual Visiting Scholars cohort, we are also preparing to hear the project presentations of our previous cohort. So please save these dates to hear from Dr. Sue Rosser on November 9th and Dr. Erin Winterround on December 13th, both at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. We will share registration information in the near future. Also want to share that, of course, the ARC Network community is always welcome to join the programming of our home organization, WePan. And we are also excited through some of this programming to feature members of the advanced community. So first up, we have our WePan Accelerator Program Days, where we are taking an intersectional approach to entrepreneurial education and development. And we have some really incredible pieces that we'll be sharing there. We are also dropping the link in the chat for registration for that. We're really excited for our Women in Engineering Program Day coming up on October 18th, where we will be engaging with the community who support and maintain women in engineering, women in science and engineering, and minorities and minoritized folks in engineering programs in higher ed. And we will be featuring former advanced PI and member, longstanding supporter of advanced work, Dr. Jenna Carpenter. And we will also be featuring, to provide our workshop on the program day, Dr. Lupita Montoya, who is a co-PI for the Advanced Spaces program. So we really encourage you to join us for that. And we will also be featuring for our Women of Color Summit, where we're centering women of color in STEM and the drive to advance equity and inclusion. We will be featuring another member of the advanced community, Dr. Tatiana Camacho, as our keynote speaker there. And that will be on November 15th. So we thank you all so much, and we hope that you have a great rest of the week and a restorative weekend. And we hope that you all take care. Thank you again for joining us. Okay, so I'm going to stop recording.